G'day. Welcome to the AgriCoach podcast for families on the land who want to grow their family's wealth and prosperity across the generations. I'm your host, Ben Law, and I'm the financial bloke. G'day, everyone, and welcome back to the Wealth and Wisdom podcast. One of the more difficult transitions I see rural producers face is navigating the evolution from being a hands-on rural producer to more of an agribusiness manager. But that pales into comparison when an agribusiness manager realises they need to grow from a business manager to a leader with a capital L. A leader of the employees, a leader of the operation, and finally, a leader in the family. This shift often occurs within succession plans, allowing the next generation to assume leadership roles. Alternatively, it arises when ambitious individuals create an operation which has the scale and complexity that demands effective leadership to steer the ship towards achieving what I call their big, hairy, audacious goals. Well, where do you find leadership qualities? Well, quite often they're forged on the sporting field, where individuals learn valuable lessons in teamwork, resilience, and strategic thinking. Athletes who have excelled in their respective sports offer a wealth of wisdom that can be applied to farming leadership, strategies for motivation, communication, and decision-making that have proven successful in competitive arenas help develop farming leaders. It helps them refine their own leadership styles and enhance their ability to steer their growing ag enterprise towards success. Our guest today is an ex-professional athlete who knows a lot about developing agricultural leaders. His name's Beau Robinson, and he's a leadership and high-performance mindset coach for the ag industry. A country lad himself, Beau grew up in Dubbo and he comes from solid ag stock, with his dad a lifetime member of the Camberwell Drovers Hall of Fame. Beau played professional rugby for 10 years, playing for the Queensland Reds and our beloved Wallabies, but also winning the Super Rugby Grand Final in 2008 and the Super Rugby Championships in 2011. So without further delay, welcome Beau.
Thanks, Ben. Thanks for having me on the podcast and excited for our chat.
Yeah, mate, it'd be fantastic. So where I want to kick off with, Beau, is, you've had a decade-long career as a professional rugby player and you had the opportunity to work closely with some real world-class players, mentors and coaches. Now, I know this is going to be really tough for you trying to single one out, but can you sort of share one example of a standout leader for yourself and what made them exceptional in your eyes?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think there's two things to differentiate, that a leader and a captain can be the same thing, but they can also be very much different. Some of the best leaders that I've been fortunate enough to play with, people that didn't necessarily have official leadership roles or positions. I think a couple of guys, Ben Daly, Leroy Houston, Anthony Fanga, all guys who were great leaders, as I said, but didn't necessarily have, vice captain or captaincy roles. And then you get people like, James Hall, who was a captain and also a great leader. And, I think what I admired about those guys is that they always led through their actions, but they're also very good team members that were willing to support everyone around them and get the best out of not only themselves, but those that they were playing with and even training. Even some of those guys like Leroy Houston, I think I use him as an example in a lot of the work that I do when going in teams. I think he started the first two games of the Super Rugby season in 2011 and then unfortunately got dropped, but he's like commitment to the team and the success of that team in 2011 was instrumental. He might have played later in the season, but ultimately he wasn't in the 23 week in, week out, but was just a great contributor.
And did you find those people that you mentioned, did you find they were just naturally born as good leaders? They rose through the ranks and it was obvious they were, or was it something they had to work at?
That's a good question. I think you can definitely be naturally born with it. People say natural leaders aren't born, but I think you can walk into I've got two kids, 7 and 8. You can walk into a kindergarten in year 1 and you can see who the little leaders are within the, when their team's the playground, the school classroom. So I think you can some people are naturally gifted and then other people can develop those skills. So some people have the natural skills and then you further enhance and develop those leadership skills. In saying that, but as I said, some of the best leaders also in a team environment, they weren't necessarily focused on getting the best out of people. They just led through their actions. Like, they weren't big talkers, big speakers, but everyone just, they're naturally drawn to them because of the way they held themselves and the way they went about things too.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I do in my working with families is I've learnt over time that I don't necessarily listen to what people say. I look at the way they act. And I think good leaders, generally, you have to judge them based on the way they act, not what they say. And sometimes you can end up with a wolf in sheep's clothing that says all the right things, but is a bloody terrible leader. Did you find a little bit of that?
Yeah, most definitely, right? Like, I think sometimes people think that everything's all rosy in the professional sporting world, but that's far from the case. And I suppose I've been fortunate enough that I've been a part of teams, cultures, environments where, they've gone from the bottom or, mid-table to the top, and then maybe found themselves back down again. And okay, what's the reason for that? And from my perspective, it's often, leaders and leadership. So often when you go in organisations and businesses, companies, our team's not performing as well as we could. And, well, first of all, let's look at the leaders and the leadership. What can they do to improve? Because ultimately they set the culture, and then, you can see increased performances within teams once you've got all that right. So, and you see that again with sporting teams and analogies.
And so leaders really did have a big impact on culture and could change culture fairly quickly, would you find?
Oh, massively. I think, if you get that top 10% right, the rest will follow. Like, naturally, we were animals, right? We want to follow the leaders, and not everyone wants to be a leader, and you just got to make sure that leaders are all on the same page and, tracking in the same direction.
It's interesting, Beau. Both my great-grandfathers were in the First World War. One was in Gallipoli and the other one was in the trenches in the Battle of the Somme and on the Western Front. I've done a lot of research and reading just because it's a personal interest. And one of the things I noticed, and I've heard other people say it from time to time, sometimes the best leaders are the most reluctant. They're the ones that aren't climbing for power. Have you found that, mate, that quite often the people that end up rising to the top and are really solid quality leaders that people will follow aren't necessarily the ones that want to do it?
Yep, most definitely. Like, again, they don't want to, but they naturally lead through their actions, right? Like, they just go about doing the right things. And again, they're not trying to inspire or motivate those around them, but they just naturally attract followers. And, I think a couple of people that come to mind, going back to, I suppose, a bit of the rugby, would be Wycliffe Palu, who was the number 8 at the New South Wales Waratahs. Spoke very rarely, seldomly, but just had an aura about him. And the other one's probably George Smith, right? Like, arguably the best rugby player Australia's ever seen. Unbelievable leader from what I've heard, on the pitch and off the pitch. But there's a guy who didn't necessarily have aspirations to be the captain.
Yeah. And so what changes in them, Beau? Like, you've seen those people that, and I've seen them myself, people that are maybe more introverted. They don't like the spotlight necessarily, but then they rise up to being in those leadership positions when they're reluctant. What changes in them, do you think?
Well, I don't know that they necessarily found themselves in, again, going back to the official leadership roles, they didn't necessarily find themselves in those official leadership roles, but they just had that, we talk about in that leadership game, that personal and positional influence, and they just had personal influence, right? People didn't follow them because of their position, just because of, the way they conducted themselves, I suppose.
Yeah, okay. Now, one of the most difficult transitions I see in agribusiness owners, Beau, is they have to tackle this transition from being, on the tools, hands-on farming, to more of a multifaceted leadership role. They're managing the business, the operations of the business, they're leading employees, they're managing crises, and they're also leading the family, which in a family business is one of the most important roles. Now, from your perspective, mate, how important is effective leadership in the long-term success and prosperity of especially a multi-generational family business?
Yeah, it's probably, arguably one of the most challenging environments to actually lead in, because there's so many different dynamics and so much history, right, within the farm, within the business, whatever it may be, and obviously just the relationships with children involved. So it's unbelievably challenging. And I suppose, coming back to that, it is somewhat dependent on the variables, the size of the operation, how big is it? Are we talking, a son wants to come back and, come onto the farm with mum and dad, or is it, there are a couple of siblings involved and they want to go through expansion? So I suppose, in regard to that, you've got to give a bit more context, but when you're going through that and you're starting to see it a lot more, where I think they've always been inclined to come back, but more so now I think it's quite appealing. And probably because of COVID, we saw it a fair bit down in New South Wales, where people who maybe had no intentions to go back to the farm all of a sudden went, you know what, I don't want to live in Sydney. Like, who wants to live in Sydney with kids? Madness. We want to go back to the country and go back to the farm and raise our kids there and have that lifestyle. And so how do you integrate those people into the operations? And, you know, is it sustainable or viable with all that? And there's some tough discussions that need to be had around what does this actually look like?
Well, it's really hard too, because you know, you see that those two roles where you've all of a sudden got someone come back, but I've seen a lot of families where they've just all of a sudden got this scale where they've got multiple employees, multiple properties, complexity, they're exporting, they've got multiple divisions in the business. And all of a sudden they're thrust into this position where your most valuable role is not to be on the tools. You know, you should be doing the $10,000 an hour jobs back in the office, negotiating deals, doing marketing, etc. And that's a real transition because and the problem is they haven't sort of been raised through this organisation where they started at the bottom and they got someone to sort of, I suppose you'd say, be mentored by to be able to grow through. And they just find themselves waking up one day and they've got this multi-million-dollar business and they're looking around going, I'm just so isolated. Whereas in the sporting field, we don't get that. And I think that's a real difficult transition for people. And they don't call themselves a leader. So they're absolutely reluctantly in a leadership position.
Yeah, and here's an interesting one. Are you seeing a lot of people with those families and businesses that you are dealing with where those that are coming from maybe a corporate or, you know, university education and then wanting to come in and they don't have necessarily the on-the-ground, on-farm experience, and so there can be quite conflict of opinions and perspectives around how things should be run. And I suppose, and it makes sense with what you're doing, the financial planning, well, okay, where do we want to get to, right? What are we aiming to achieve? And who is going to do this? Who's going to be responsible for, you know, the strategic decisions once we've sort of set what does the goal look like, whether it be the end goal or the next 5-10 years, whatever that may be. And then who's in charge of the operational decisions and, you know, having agreement, you know, that clarity on who is responsible for that. And I think it's so applicable to so many different aspects, not only in the workplace, but life. Like clarity leads to confidence, right? When everyone knows who's doing what, who's responsible for what, because ultimately you see it, it's definitely not uncommon where someone's told that they've got these responsibilities, they've got to make these decisions, and yet maybe, you know, mum and dad can't let go, or one of the siblings can't let go and accept that that person is responsible for that. So in regards to, you know, the ability to let go, that is quite hard for those that maybe have stayed on farm, right, or on station, whatever it may be, to then let go and realise, okay, instead of leading now, I've actually got to manage a bit more. So I've got to let go. I've got to trust the people that are doing it. If you can't do that, you are absolutely going to burn yourself out because you're wearing two hats, which is okay as long as you can balance that, but it's knowing when do I have to, you know, get in the office and do all of that management stuff in terms of people, but obviously the business, and then when do I actually have to get my hands dirty and lead and make sure I maintain that credibility. And that's a really challenging act. And even, you know, in the corporate world, finding a lot of farm managers find themselves in those roles and they really struggle to just, I've got to be able to trust my people. I've got to be able to do that. And what are the strategies and tactics to do that? So, and then you've got, again, maybe those people that do come in from, they've gone away to university, done an agribusiness degree, you know, agronomy, whatever, that they almost want to go straight into that management role, and yet they don't have that credibility, or they haven't, you know, earned their stripes, or, you know, they haven't been tested, and possibly less inclined to listen to those people that do have the experience on the ground, including their parents, which is not always easy to do, right? Like I do a bit of work with my old man, and it can be quite interesting, and sometimes you've got to make your own mistakes, don't you? Like, you know, yep, you were right, I should have listened to you, but it is what it is. But you've also got to come back and show that you, especially with your workers, that you're going to earn their respect, and you've got to get that credibility, not only in your decision-making, but in your work ethic.
And so you've worked really closely in the corporate ag space as well with a lot of larger organisations. So when you look at a scaling up family agribusiness versus, say, a corporate entity, what are the corporates doing really well that the family sector could learn from?
Well, I think you've got to look at it as a business, right? That's first and foremost. And where do we want to get to? Otherwise, if you can't find yourself, instead of being that farm operator and you can't get in there and make those, strategic decisions, and which means actually, unfortunately, whether you like it or not, getting, out of the paddock, out of the tractor, off the horse, off the motorbike. And as I said, not completely, right? Don't get me wrong. I'm not silly. That's why people get into that, why they love that industry, why they love that lifestyle, because they still want that. But the big decisions are generally made in the office and their ability to do that. So once you can do that, from what I've seen, experienced, observed, heard, right, it's that, okay, we are going to turn this into an actual business and we're going to run it like a business more professionally so that you can scale, because it's really hard. And not just in the agricultural industry, I think also you see it in many other industries. Can the actual leader let go and have trust in their people? And have they got the right systems, processes, whatever it may be in place? But ultimately it's the people, right? And the ability to do that. So, because once you get there, once you break through that, then, that's when things can really happen.
And I think if you look at most of the people that are moving into leadership roles, there's a bit of a difficulty, I find, in giving themselves permission not to be on the tools. And you use the sporting analogy and you go, well, the coach wouldn't be out on the field playing the game. He's sitting on the sidelines watching what's going on and directing the traffic, basically, and coaching people. And if you're running a big agribusiness with, family members working or multiple staff working across multiple locations, your job is not necessarily to be on the tools all the time. And they've got to let go of the guilt of not being there. And now the question I've probably got is, did you find a lot of player captains or players on the field that transitioned into a coaching role? Did you find they found that was a difficult transition for them, Beau?
Yes, they did. But it is much easier in the fact that you literally can't jump on the field.
Yeah, that's what I mean. Like the complexity of, I've been playing for 10, 15, 20 years of my life. Now I'm the coach. I just want to jump on the field and help everyone out.
Yeah. Well, I suppose what I'm saying there is it's hard for them to let go. And, you sort of, they say you're so out of control because ultimately on game day, you have, it's done and dusted pretty much. You have very little influence on game day. I suppose when you're in a farming perspective, you can still easily jump back in the afternoon, right? And so how do you do that? So for some people, it is the actual individuals, right? Ability to accept that that's what that new role or position entails. But just wait, do we actually have the support of our siblings or our parents that is going to be okay and that is important stuff, right? Because for some people, particularly if their parents have been, working bloody hard on the farm and they've got, righto, well, we've got to expand this. Hard work is determined by, labour intensive, like how much work you're actually doing. But the big decisions when you're starting to expand or wanting to expand, that's not necessarily the case, because you can get someone to replace you and do that, take over that. So again, is everyone in support of that? Is everyone understanding of that? Because, if you've got, let's say, a daughter and two brothers and the daughter's been appointed as growing the business and doing the strategic stuff, and then the brothers come in and they're whinging and complaining that they're not doing anything on farm, well, there's conflict, there's tension there, isn't there? But that's not necessarily that person's role. And I use that as an example. It might be the brother and the daughter are then frustrated possibly because the son's been, it doesn't matter the dynamics of the makeup of that, but you've got to have everyone, I suppose, understanding what the roles and responsibilities are and the importance of that and getting that buy-in. That commitment to the common goal is a common phrase and term that I use, and again, applicable to any team, family, business relationship.
Yeah, it's one of the things that I'm really passionate about, Beau, is telling people you've got to have accountability roles in a business. So you need to work out what those roles are and who's ultimately accountable. And, the general terms is generally there's three areas. There's the HR and finance, there's sales and marketing, and then there's essentially operations in a farming operation. And so what happens with mum and dad is they generally sit across all those. But as you start to get employees and family members come back, well, then you need to figure out what those roles are and who's going to fulfill them. And a mistake I see families make is they don't clearly delineate that role, and they don't say who is accountable, not who's got to do it. It's who's accountable. Who does the buck stop with? And then, you see the situation where you go, oh, is the tax planning being done with the accountant? Oh, did you do that? Oh, no, I thought you, and nothing ever gets done. And so that needs to be done. But someone in the family needs to take the leadership role to be able to work that out and say, hey, Beau, this is your role, mate. This is what you're accountable for. Get that job done.
Yeah. And again, that's hard when everyone feels as though like everyone in one shape or another has ownership, I suppose, of what's going on, right? So there's no necessarily designated leader, because I've seen plenty of operations where mum or dad owns the business or the farm, or both of them do, but they want to be in charge, but they don't want to be leading and driving that, if that makes sense. So, right, who's actually doing that? Who is responsible for even facilitating that discussion? And some families do it well, but then also some families don't find it as easy. So they need to go and get, external support in there, independent, external person that doesn't come in with the preconceived ideas and relationships and emotions, and manage that, facilitate that.
I did a webinar recently for Beef 24, and one of the pieces of advice I give to young people all the time, Beau, because I get a lot of them come in and they say, look, I'm coming back into the family business. And one of the common complaints is, we love our parents, we respect and we see how hard they've worked, and we're not taking anything away, but we just want things to be done more professional. We want our accountability roles. We want to drive the business forward. All these sorts of things. They're frustrated. And my common statement to them is, well, become the leader in the family. Like, work on yourself, grow, start to take those leadership positions. So if there is, for example, family meetings need to happen and they aren't happening in the meeting, well, be the champion of the family meetings. Start to run those things and act like a leader. Now, you might not have ultimate control, but you start to, like you mentioned, the players before that start to exude that leadership type qualities. People will start to naturally be attracted to them and then default. And I think that's the best bit of advice to young people. If you're not getting what you want, start to become the person that would get that or would attract that.
Yeah. In regards to that, mate, it's definitely got to drive that. Is everyone committed to growth, though? What's the purpose of that, right? Like, okay, do we actually want to grow this, or are we just happy to, just maintain what we're going through? And again, if we do have the kids coming back, is this actually, viable, financially viable? And, it can be challenging even to ask your parents, is this actually financially viable? Like, how are we going to split this up? This succession planning is a tough conversation, for especially those that don't like having tough conversations, right? So, okay, well, this isn't going to be financially viable if you can get them to say that. But if it isn't, how do we grow it to a stage where it is going to be? Because you can go running those meetings, but if you don't have the reason behind what is the purpose of them, and everyone knows what the purpose of a meeting is, but why are we trying to implement something like that, such as these meetings? We've got to know what the future holds or what we're aiming to achieve in the future to ensure that. Otherwise, mum, dad or brother or sister might go, nah, these meetings are a waste of time. What's the purpose of them? We all know what we're doing. Yeah, but again, it's setting the future, right?
Today's episode is brought to you by AgriCoach. You've worked bloody hard over the years and you've built a solid operation. But as your children grow up and start their own journeys, you're beginning to think about the next 5, 10, and even 15 years and how to keep driving the business forward and ensure a smooth and successful succession plan. Preparing the business, preparing the next generation, and preparing for your eventual retirement all requires a solid plan and a proven process. Unsure about the right steps to take? Head on over to agricoach.com.au/webinar to learn more about our Succession Proof Your Family webinar. AgriCoach, aligning families, growing wealth, and protecting legacies. And now, let's get back to the episode. Yeah, and that's a problem in most families is they don't have a strategic plan, Beau. They don't know where they're going. They don't know what they're doing. They're just existing day to day and just doing what they've normally done. And that's a major reason why intergenerationally businesses fail is they don't have what we call a family created strategic plan and everyone's aligned to that plan. And that's a major problem we see. And so I keep encouraging the younger ones to say, work on your personal leadership skills, work on your personal growth, become more self-aware, become a better communicator, become a better strategic planner, a strategic thinker. Don't go in and tell mum and dad what to do. Ask questions. What's your plan, mum and dad? I heard someone, I think it was Jill Rigney, who I interviewed the other week. Her question was, she said, Ben, go to your parents and say, do we all agree that we would like to be better than where we are now? And she said most people will say yes, and then you can start to open that discussion with your family. And I think that's a great leadership question, is to ask that. Does it want to be better? Well, what does that look like? What does better look like? And maybe better's not scaling up and borrowing another 20 million to buy another place. Maybe it's just get more effective. For some families, it could be splitting up a partnership. It could be selling some land to reduce debt. It could be diversifying off farm. There's a whole raft of things they could possibly do, but they've got to start to have those conversations, and it requires leadership in there to do it. And if mum and dad don't have the skills or aren't wanting to do it, Beau, someone's got to fill that gap, don't they?
Yeah, most definitely. Sometimes the message that we're wanting to deliver is not going to be received because of the relationship that we have with our parents, right? So even like getting people to listen to this podcast or Jill Rigney's podcast, sometimes it's planting the seed because it's actually a different voice, different perspective. Like I've talked to a few people that went like, I went to this seminar. They did, but let's say mum or dad did. And they said, look, we've been banging on about succession planning and the future and how important it is to have strategic. And one of the parents is like, I heard this podcast, or, I went and heard this speaker at this event. And anyway, we came home and we started setting the plans right then, right? They'd been banging on about it. So if you're not having success with that, maybe it is planting the seed a different way to see if it's a different voice, a different perspective that someone is more inclined to listen to. And, even the stuff that I do, so often I'll, be delivering training, whatever, facilitating, and a message. And the managers, it might be regional manager, CEO, CIO, they're like, you've said exactly what I said. And I said, yeah, I know, but I've got a different position. I might have told a different story or delivered it a different way, right? Different context. And all of a sudden it just sinks in. And that also happens with, husbands and wives, right? And boyfriends and girlfriends, like, so-and-so said this down the road last week. I've been saying that to you for years and you won't listen to me. But, you've just got to keep looking at different ways.
That's a bloody good point. I know my wife doesn't listen to anything I say, so I always have to be able to plant the seeds with someone else to tell her, and then she goes, I come up with this. No, that's not what happens. She outsmarts me all the time. But so, Beau, you train in this. You know what they look like. What does an effective leader look like?
I think from my perspective, right, there's no one size fits all in terms of leadership. You're much more likely to have good results when you are self-aware, so you know what your strengths or your weaknesses, although I'd say, try to refrain from using the term weaknesses, maybe areas to improve, whatever that may be. And that can be okay in terms of operationally, right? Maybe I'm not the best horseman, not the best stockman, whatever that may be, but I understand and I enjoy my strengths are with the business side of it. And my ability to communicate and connect with people, or maybe to sell, to market, right? And there's so many different aspects to that. One of the activities I do with the leaders, and I'm, what are my strengths and my areas to improve, as a leader in my role, maybe as a team member also, within maybe farm managers, within fellow farm managers, but maybe within other departments. What am I like as a follower? Because generally everyone's a follower. And the CEO is reporting to the board of directors, and you can go down to a husband. So you want to have that credibility through capability in terms of, I can actually do what I expect of my people. I think that always helps.
Is that a competence thing, Beau? Like, am I competent in my role?
Yep. You don't always have to be the best, but to have a level of competency will earn the respect of those around you. And again, that might not even be necessarily in knowledge, it might be work ethic, right? Maybe it is knowledge, whatever that may be. That always helps. So you've got to have that self-awareness, and it always helps to have an awareness and understanding of people, right? Ultimately, it's really interesting when you're working with the pastoral companies. They're so observant with their horses, their dogs, their cattle. And I go, Right, the principles are exactly the same. And, the low stress stock handling, I've done one of those, which is pretty interesting. They're so applicable and transferable to people. And yet they usually invest so much time and energy and effort into understanding their stock and how to work animals, and yet sort of switch off a bit when it comes to their people.
Or even their family.
Oh, yeah, their family, right, most definitely. And so because why we want to know that is the ability to adapt, right? Not every horse is the same. Not every beast is the same. Not every dog is the same. So how do I adapt accordingly to what they need? And you've got to be able to do that. Like, it's not about meeting in the middle when you're a leader. I talk to my ladies, get out of that, meet in the middle. That's not, you're in this role and position and you're on a different pay grade. You've got to make the effort. And I say, you've got to be willing to go, I believe, 90%. You've got to get 90%, especially until you've built, and you've got to have at least 10% commitment from the other person. And then once you've built that connection, then you can start to work with them and take them anywhere, right? And so often, and I think it's males, particularly in regional and rural Australia, particularly in the agricultural industry, you've got to be able to build a connection with your people to get their capabilities up. Gone are the days when you can command and get compliance, right? And that's a big shift in terms of leadership in this day and age. Gone are the days like you said your grandfathers were they were told to go over the trenches. You don't ask questions, you just go. Like, there's no way in the world that's happening. It can be hard enough to get someone to sweep up the shed. Right? So, and ultimately, I think you've got to be genuine and authentic. You've got to know, again, yourself, what are my strengths, what are my areas to improve, and show that you're working on those, but don't try to be someone that you're not. I think, when you see a leader that's genuine and authentic, people admire that and they trust that. And I think that's one of the greatest compliments that people can have when they've got this leader. Who knows? Everyone's got limitations, right? Everyone's got areas that they need to improve. They've got the humility to admit that. People say they're so genuine and authentic, and what it does is it just calms us because, we feel comfortable around them because we feel as though what we're seeing is who they are.
Yeah. The word humble comes to mind in a lot of the good leaders I've known over the years, Beau, is generally, like you said, they're genuine and authentic and they're humble and not necessarily looking for the accolades. They don't need to be the one in lights. They're happy to stand behind their team, aren't they?
Yeah, actually, that reminds me. It was a call yesterday I got from a lady at Tambo. And she was saying, I went to an event where Cameron Smith, the Melbourne Storm and Australian captain, was speaking. And she said, oh, my God, he was just so humble and genuine and authentic. Like, you see him on the TV, but then when you hear him speak and then you talk to him at the bar, he was the exact same person. And she said, I just really admired that. And, I've been fortunate enough to meet him in a pub as well. And he is. Like, he's just, there's no two different personas. He is who he is. It's so refreshing.
Yeah, there's a couple of points there that I really love, Beau, which I've written down, and we'll steal those, mate, and label them. No, I won't. Number one is don't meet them in the middle. I think that's a really good one for families in the sense of I continually hear people say, well, I've gone halfway. They need to meet me in the middle, or I've mended the bridge with Dad a little bit. He's got to come over to me now. But if you want to be an effective leader, you got to push it to the 90%. You got to put in all the effort, and then you can lead them in any direction you want. I thought that was bloody fantastic, mate. And then the other one was you've got to be adaptable. I like that. So as a leader, you've got to be adaptable and you've got to put multiple hats on and you've got to be able to communicate with different people, build respect, build rapport, and then, be really self-aware. Because I think that's a big limitation to so many people is these days we just don't seem to, I don't know whether it's we're not self-aware or we just don't like admitting that we have areas that need to improve or we might have been the reason. And I wrote down here, Beau, that most leaders I don't see, very few of them are ever victims, are they?
Oh, no.
They don't see they're in a role, they're like true proper leaders. They don't sit back and cry about things and feel like a victim. They feel like they're empowered and in control. Is that right?
Yeah, most definitely. I think that's, successful people in general. And there is a disconnect in society, and probably because of social media, right, that you don't have to take ownership and responsibility for what's happening. Like, you can just, have a blast on Facebook and, do it anonymously these days. It's ridiculous. So, we are going a little bit that way inclined, which is not great. But I was talking to a lady yesterday, and there was a few stuff-ups within the company. And his unbelievable was just taking so much ownership and responsibility. He's like, yep, I've got to get this sorted. And things weren't necessarily, within his control or his fault, but they happened, I suppose, under his watch, right?
Well, that's a leader, isn't it? We take responsibility, yeah.
Yeah, and it was unbelievable. You just admire his attitude and perspective. Yeah.
Because that was one thing I used to do when I had the financial advice practice before I retired from that. And I used to always say to my team, if anything ever happens, I need to know straight away. If something goes wrong with a client file, if we make an error, we make a mistake, I need to know straight away. Tell me straight away. And if we had a mistake, and we had one happen, I think a couple of years before we sold the business, and we made a mistake on the investments for a client, just a transposition of numbers on an application form. And anyhow, we found out about 3 months later when we were auditing things, and I looked at it, and the client was better off by about 24 grand. So their portfolio, because of the mistake, had done better than it would have if it had been invested appropriately. And I picked up the phone, I called them up and I told them. They said, why are you bloody telling us this, Ben? And I said, well, because we made a mistake. And they said, yeah, but we're better off. You could have just hit it. And I'm like, well, no, we want to tell you because that's how we build trust. But the point I'm probably trying to make is that I said to the girls that made the mistake, the team, is I said, ultimately this lies with me because I'm the leader. I'll ring the client and tell them. And when I spoke to the client, I said, this is my mistake. I'm the advisor. I'm the owner of the business. My team made the mistake, so it's me. And I think when I look at the agricultural industry, I try and stress to the younger generation coming through is extreme ownership. Take ownership for all the problems, and then you're empowered. You're not a victim. And that's the way I try and get them to change their mindset is go into these. If there's problems in the family, if things aren't going right, you have some role in this problem. Whatever's happened, you've contributed in some way, shape or form. And if you can see it that way and start to say, okay, how did this happen? Then you're empowered, you're not a victim, and you can start to make amends. And I think if we can get our next generation to start to think like that are moving into leadership positions in these ag spaces, they're going to be far better off long term than sitting around just being a victim.
It's a good point, right? And again, that can be one of the issues within any operation team, whatever, with the family. If someone slips up and makes a mistake and, the parent's coming down on them because they made a mistake, like you're going to be less inclined to come and take ownership and you're avoid it. You're going to be quite defensive as opposed to, okay, what's the approach here? What went wrong and what's the lesson in this? How do we address it? Because, again, going back to some of the stuff I do, they're like, oh, yeah, but that stuff up. And I'm like, yeah, but that's how we learn, right? You can tell someone how to ride a bike and they can watch a video 1,000 times, but ultimately they've got to fall off a few times. So it's about understanding what are the risks of the decisions that I'm going to delegate to them and what are their skills and capabilities to understand that. And I said, if you go and allow someone to make a decision that's going to have a significant impact on the business or the farm or whatever, then you've probably given them, a decision that is way above their pay grade. So don't look at doing those ones. And, I do draw up a matrix there. So in terms of skill and risk and making sure it's aligned there because you've got to allow people to make mistakes. We all make mistakes.
Well, that's where the lessons are.
Exactly right. It's inevitable. So, but if you come down on someone, and again, this is important, within siblings as well. If you have a crack at someone because they made a mistake, well, then everyone's going to get their back up. Next time you make a mistake, you can expect retaliation, right? So that comes back to the commitment and the common goal. And when I'm debriefing within teams, I'll go, what are your fuck-ups? I want them to be open honest. Come to me with your fuck-ups because we all make them. And I remember having a chat with a regional manager one day, and he said to me one of the challenges and frustrations that one of his farm managers would never take ownership for the mistakes, even though he knew it had. And I said, I've noticed that in our sessions that you haven't shared any of your fuck-ups. So why would he be inclined to do that if he doesn't see you do it? And as soon as he started to do it, the farm manager started to do it too. So, if dad or whoever's at the top of the organisation, the business, or mum, right, doesn't matter, takes ownership, is willing to be vulnerable, share the experiences and the lesson learned how they would have done it differently, then everyone else is more inclined to do that. And they won't definitely do that, but more inclined because, we're here to support each other and learn from it. And that's, again, that commitment of the common goal.
Yeah, I like that. I read somewhere once, Beau, for the next generation, the responsibility without the ability to make an error is a fearsome burden.
Yeah.
And so that's the first way to destroy the motivation of the next generation is to expect them to be perfect. And, quite often I've seen mistakes happen, Beau, with families, and I've had a chat to dad and he's blown up about, son's made this mistake. And I'll give you a really funny short one, but I remember the son had got out of his apprenticeship, bought a Land Cruiser ute, and then gone and spent some money on a new bull bar. It already had a bull bar, then he put a new one on it and had a new set of wheels and an exhaust pipe, and Dad was going rank. You're wasting your money on all this bloody stuff. And I sat Dad down. I said, righto, young fella, what was your first vehicle? And he looked at me strangely. He says, well, what do you mean? I said, what did you modify on your first vehicle when you started working? And he said, oh, bloody hell, it's none of your business. And he'd literally done the same thing when he was younger. And now I know that's not a mistake, but it's like we forget what we went through to learn, and we were all young and we were all learning once, but we forget it. We just forget over time. And one of the things, Beau, that I quite often use for myself is what I call the 3 R's when things don't go quite right, is I'll actually review it. I'll review what I'm doing. Like I'll review the strategy and go, okay, this isn't working. How can I review it? I'll then realign. So I'll adjust and realign my tact, and then I'll go re-engage and get back on the game. And I think I try and tell people that if you can stop, take stock of it, review it, what worked, what didn't work, what we do different next time, realign, okay, what are we going to do now? And then get back into it. They're going to be far better off than sitting around screaming, yelling and crying about the mistakes that were made.
Yeah, I was having that conversation earlier in the week with actually, it was a father and a son, or with the father, but he's like, oh, we'll talk about it, at the end of the season. And I was like, okay. And he follows the Bulldogs. And I said to him, you follow the Bulldogs, yeah? And he says, yeah, I do. Bulldogs Rugby League. And I said, I assume you're hoping that the Bulldogs aren't waiting till the end of the season until they start reviewing their season. He's like, no way in the world. And I said, well, it's the exact same thing with the family operation, right? You want to get onto that as quickly as possible because the lesson needs to be learned right then and there, and you can address it and rectify it. Don't wait. I think that's something in terms of families and the corporate that we wait too long. We'll do the performance review in 6 months' time. It's long gone by then. You've missed a massive opportunity.
Yeah, you've lost the lesson. You've only got the mistake then, don't you? So, mate, let's say you've got someone, Beau, that comes in and they go, I've just sort of fallen into this leadership role. It's probably in a family. No one else has picked up the ball and run with it. Everyone's standing around doing their thing and they want to transition into a leadership role within there. How can they actually start doing that, mate? Because like you got to go into sport. You got, great people to mentor you and coach you and model and to thrive in that. Whereas a lot of the rural producers are just stuck out their property and isolated. How would you advise someone to go start their journey and become a competent leader?
And I think there's that professional aspect with, understanding what does a successful business look like, right? And what do I need to do to build that up? And then there's that personal side in terms of, relationships and communication and whatnot and doing that. And there's so much out there these days with books and podcasts and YouTube, right? If you are isolated, then you can access so much information that once upon a time wouldn't be able to do that, and start that awareness, both in terms of self-awareness and, what's the unconscious incompetent? I can't even think what it is. The conscious.
It's unconsciously incompetent, consciously incompetent, and then competent.
And then it goes back up to unconsciously competent, such as driving the car. Manual anyway, not an auto. But, that journey doesn't stop, right? And that's what I suppose I really like about the leaders that I've been working with. They're like, they've achieved so much, but they've still got the humility to say, I don't know everything. I get external people in, I get independent people in, I get consultants in, or, you're in charge of the finance. You tell me what this should look like. You're in charge of WHS. You tell me what this should look like. You're on that station. You tell me what that should look like, what you're thinking we should be doing there in terms of numbers, all the infrastructure. I really like that. I've got the humility to just, and they're comfortable in themselves, right? They don't have to know everything. But it's starting that journey around, and ultimately for the personal stuff, the leadership stuff is right. Well, what are my strengths? What are my areas to improve? And then how do I develop those? What is it? And there's just so much out there that you can do. So many good books.
It sounds like curiosity is a big part of that.
Curiosity, yeah, I love the curiosity.
I think my episode with Katie Godden was we spend a whole lot of time making statements and not asking questions in families.
Yes.
And so we come to these positions as we want to make a statement about something rather than being curious and asking questions. And again, if you just rattled off a whole lot of questions, when you were talking, what do you think? How do you think that should look? That's your area. How can you help me? It's like questions rather than just statements seems to be a fairly important point.
Yeah, right. And that's powerful, right? When you are talking about, okay, you're getting into this leadership role, is the ability to ask those questions, get people's opinions, perspectives. And if you don't agree with it, instead of just saying you don't agree with it, go, have you considered this then? Or what may be the repercussions? Have you considered that, right? So you're still getting that collaboration. We're still working together, right? And then that person may arrive at the same decision and perspective, or they may not, but you've got a better understanding of their rationale, their logic, their reasoning behind that. And if they do, and you go, right, that's a great idea, then all of a sudden that person's got ownership for it, right? That's their idea. And if you want to be a great leader, it's allowing people, even if you've got the exact same opinion and perspective, allow them to come up with it, because they'll feel much more empowered, right? We love clarity and we want that direction, but we also love autonomy as humans, like that we're actually contributing.
Yeah, that's an important point. How important is resilience, mate?
Resilience is an interesting one. I think you're going to segue into the book.
Well, before you start, tell us about the book, Beau.
So I did write a book that once I finished my rugby career in the first year or two that I was back in Dubbo, and it's called In the Arena, which is, I suppose, a takeoff of The Man in the Arena, the Theodore Roosevelt. It's not a poem. What is it, a passage? How do you explain that? I should know that. What leaders can learn about climbing the mountain of success again after overcoming adversity. And, probably no one faces more adversity than the agricultural industry, right? So, I talk about resilience. Resilience is the ability to bounce back. Yet I believe perseverance is even more important, right? If you're climbing a mountain, it's not just about bouncing back and staying where you are. It's about the ability to bounce back and keep progressing towards your goal. And I think, it's bloody important. And one of the biggest challenges I think everyone faces is they feel lonely and isolated when they're going through that. And that can be the benefit of reading, is that you understand that everyone's gone through it. Like, it's just part of the journey. And so you're like, it's a reminder, everyone else has gone through this. This is not just me. Everyone else is really struggling. Like, that's business, that's success, that's life. So I think that, I do a lot of reading at the moment. Ryan Holiday, who I don't know if you're familiar with. But
is that the Daily Stoic?
Yeah, he's got that. He's got The Obstacle is the Way.
Obstacle's the Way, yeah. My daughter and I read that every day. Have you got the Daily Stoic, the book?
I do have the Daily Stoic. I haven't read that. And I've also got the one about being a better father. I think it's 365 days, which my kids also like to read with me and remind me around what I'm doing.
Yeah, we read it at breakfast.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, we read it at breakfast. We get it open and she's like, what does this even mean, Dad? Because it's obviously Stoic wisdom from back in Roman and Greek times, isn't it? But it's great.
Yeah. Again, all the stuff that they encountered back then. Well,
Marcus Aurelius talks about it, doesn't he? One of Rome's greatest leaders.
Yeah, it's all the same stuff. And I think that is, again, just reassuring for me personally anyway, to read that. And you're like, far out, everyone's overcome things. It is what it is. Such is life, right?
Yeah. And it's pretty true. I mean, I get, and I'm sure you do get the same, is I get to meet a lot of families and I get the privilege of seeing behind the curtain, so to speak, is what's happening in family dynamics. And 9 times out of 10, people do feel really like they're unique in their suffering and that their suffering's far worse than everyone else's.
Yeah.
But quite often there's a bit of perspective I can give. I mean, I had this conversation with someone the other day saying that, the problems you're facing are difficult. I get it. They're painful. But to give you some context, they're very small, easy problems to deal with compared to what a lot of other people deal with. It doesn't make it easier, but we don't share these challenges. And again, this is why the sporting field's so good, because you get to see it play out. You get to be part of a team. You get the wins, but you also get the gut-wrenching losses.
Yes.
Whereas when you're running, I know as a small business owner myself, I've started up 2 companies, it's a lonely pursuit. It's just like farming. You just plow away. You don't have a team around you that, buoys you up when you've had a bad day and then celebrates the wins. It's lonely.
But that's the benefit, right? That's also what I say when I go into teams. Like, I was like, you guys have to celebrate the wins and actually pat each other on the back a bit more. Like, that's exciting. This is what I love about team sports, that you take those losses to heart, but you take it as a collective. And as I said, you're having a bad day, well, someone else will pump you up, right? So you've got to be doing that as a family, as a team, right? Like, not always only talking about the bad things. Well, what have we actually achieved? What have we won? And again, I was having a couple of weeks ago a call with the CEO, and he's like, "Oh, I just overthink things and I care too much, and I'm probably an overstress."
Compared to what?
Well, I asked him, "What are you comparing that to?" And he goes, "Oh, well, that's how it feels." And I go, "Well, I have these conversations, and I'm fortunate enough to be privy to people in similar roles to you." I said, I don't think there's necessarily anything different than what I see when dealing with them. I know you're running a big organisation, but I've talked to people, males and females, that are running large organisations in terms of, whether it be assets or people, and they go through the exact same things.
Yep, but our suffering is far worse than everyone else's because we feel it, don't we?
Yeah. And again, I'm fortunate, I suppose, in that perspective that people are open and honest with me because of the role that I have or the position that I have. So for me, that is reassuring. And if I've got something going on, I can always, listening to what they're going through, just a constant reminder that, far out, such is life.
Yeah. It's interesting, Beau. My wife thinks it's morbid, but using my great-grandfathers again, one of the things that I practice is a little bit of a mind trick when my mind starts to get to the point where it starts to whinge and whine about things. Woe is me. I've got a 7-year-old, and I think you said you got a 6 and 8.
Yeah.
They can be a challenge sometimes, and running your own business, and you get days where you're like, woe is me, everything's piling up.
Oh, yeah.
And I quite often sit down and I'll actually, in my head, I'll say to myself, imagine if either of my great-grandfathers had got back from the First World War, or even at my age, sat down beside me and said, "What's wrong, young fella?" And I went, "Oh, these are my problems." What would they think? And I guarantee they'd look at me and go, "What the bloody hell are you worried about?" Like, put it into some perspective. Like, these are first world problems. Doesn't make them any easier, but it's trying to put those problems into perspective so we can go, okay, how do we tackle these problems? And they just become something we have to overcome rather than a tsunami of problems that we're never going to survive.
Yeah. That's it.
So, Beau, mate, this has been bloody amazing. I could talk about this stuff for days, but I want to know, where can people find more about you online? And then I've got one last question for you, which I love to ask everyone. So start off with, where can people find more about you online?
Probably LinkedIn is generally the best place that I'm most active. I obviously have a website, agtleadership.com, but I think where people get a really good feel for who I am, what I'm about, what I do is on LinkedIn. I love, connecting with people on there, and it allows the ability to follow and engage with people on there too, right? Which is, I think, a great platform. Yeah,
well, that's how you and I came across each other a couple of years ago. I think you reached out to me, and
yeah, exactly right. Yep.
And then recently I came back and said, come on the podcast. So yeah, LinkedIn's a great space, and obviously you do the leadership and coaching as well, which people can read more about.
It's a great point, right? And when people are going through, they've found themselves in that leadership role, they want to transition and whatnot. There are so many mentors and people that are willing to, give advice and give you perspective if you just reach out and connect them. Now, whether that might be in your community, right? Someone who's been through it 20 or 30 years ago, or even on LinkedIn, platforms such as LinkedIn, right? I've connected with some really interesting people. I remember one day, I think it was Sydney Airport or Brisbane Airport, I ran like 4 different people at different times that I had only connected with LinkedIn. But I genuinely follow their content. It's so interesting. Like, we're so fortunate in this day and age to be able to have so much access, and the boundaries to being connected to people is just, significantly reduced, minimized.
Excellent. Now, Beau, how old are you now, mate?
Mid-30s.
Me too. Not quite. I shaved the beard off today, so there's not as much grey.
Almost late 30s.
Yeah. So, mate, if you could go back in a time machine and literally put your arm around young Beau in your mid-20s, what's the bit of advice you'd give him?
Yeah, I've been thinking about this one. You know what? They're probably I don't think it'll be like, it'll sort itself out, right? Like as if everything just happens for a reason and it comes to you, but just keep believing in yourself and there's not much I changed about my life, to be honest. And to be fair, I've lived a pretty fortunate life, right? I've lived in 5 different countries. I've played in full stadiums, played for my country. So there's not a great deal of change, I suppose.
And now you're on the Financial Bloke podcast.
And like the highlight.
The highlight.
Yeah.
The B-reel.
Yeah, I am quite fortunate that I have had an unbelievable life, right, on many different fronts. Even with losing my brother, who was only 21 years of age, I consider myself so fortunate and grateful to have had that experience of 21 years with him. So it would just be, much like a mentor says, just have faith that you'll sort it out. You know what I mean? Yeah, have that belief that you'll sort it out, because as I said, there's not much I would change in how my life's panned out.
Yeah, it's interesting, Beau. One of the common themes that comes through, and this is my advice to 25-year-old Ben, is, without paraphrasing in multiple different ways, but essentially saying back yourself. Get to the point where you just trust in your ability to be able to do it. And,
yeah, that's probably it.
Yeah, it's like being able to, work hard and focus and do your absolute best, but just trust that you can achieve what you can achieve and stop worrying so much.
Yeah. And I think that's a pretty good point, the way you've said that, like back yourself, right? As opposed to, it'll sort itself out, because it takes so much out of your control when you say that, like it's reactive. Whereas when you say you back yourself, like it means that I'm going to be proactive and I am going to go after things, right? I don't think things, some of those books out there just say, just think about it and it'll come to you. Like, that's not how it's worked for me. Like, if I want to make things happen, I've got to go and do it. I've got to go and chase it.
Yeah, I totally agree, because I don't subscribe to the whole, to sit back and the world will come to you because you're beautiful. I don't believe in that. I believe in, the world will give you what you ask for. You just have to learn how to ask for it the right way. And for me, it's always hard work, focus, always adding value, building relationships with people, and always being better and admitting when you've got it wrong. And and that's all about backing and doing as much as you possibly can.
Yeah, very good.
Yeah, awesome, Beau. Well, look, mate, thanks very much for your time today. I know you've got a hard deadline at 4:00. So, mate, always welcome to come back on again. Love to have you back on the podcast. And I'm sure everyone will have learnt a hell of a lot today.
Thoroughly enjoyed it, Ben. Thanks for having me. And I hope, if your listeners do enjoy it, please send me a message on LinkedIn. I'd love to hear what you took away from it.
So that was a great episode again today. I love doing podcasts myself because I get to learn as much as you do. Now, the first thing I just want to run through is just a couple of points before we go. If you want to be a good leader, Beau mentioned the best leaders he's seen are humble, genuine, and authentic. Number 2, they've got a high level of self-awareness. They know their strengths and they know their weaknesses, or as Beau put it, areas of improvement. Number 3, they build respect. So they're always building respect. And number 4 is they've got good communication and they're adaptable in that communication. So they're the 4 areas mainly that Beau mentioned today. And I think if you've found yourself in a leadership position, or you think, hey, I need to become a better leader in the family, that'd be a good place to start. And one other really stupidly good point was that one he said about, if you want to be an effective leader, don't do the old, we'll meet them in the middle. So if you're having family problems, or you're just wanting your family to be, a stronger family and have a stronger business, don't sit there saying, well, I've gone halfway. Dad or mum or my son or daughter or my brother or sister need to meet me in the middle. If you want to be successful, you want to be a good leader, go to 90%, let them only have to do the last 10%. And then, once you build that rapport and get that connection, then you can lead them in the direction you want. I thought that was a really great point from Beau. That's going on a post-it note, and that is going on my wall with all my other quotes and cool bits of information I've collected. Now, we really appreciate everyone's support. I'm always getting emails of people thanking me for certain guests that come on. If you've got an idea for a podcast, if you want to learn more information, or you've got any feedback, send me an email, ben@thefinancialbloke.com.au. And if you think someone else could benefit from this podcast or any other podcast, we'd love it if you could share it with your family and friends. There's about between 5,000 and 8,000 downloads every month. So help your friends, family, and anyone you might happen to know become part of the Wealth and Wisdom tribe. Now, my name's Ben Law. That's it for today. We'll see you next time.